I can't just make sort of smallish niche strategy games anymore. I want to make something that is a lot more ambitious and that has a better chance of standing out. I've been an indie developer since 2012, I suppose. And so that was the year that the Oculus Kickstarter happened. And so I was a backer of that, got my dev kit. And then in the middle of 2013, Oculus held the Oculus VR Jam, which was like a contest to create little apps for the first Oculus Rift DK1. So I participated in that, and my entry, which eventually became my first game, Darknet, was one of the winners of that jam. And so I basically, from that point on, ended up being like the VR guy in like the local development community. And I decided to just kind of lean into that and keep doing VR projects. So Darknet went well. It came out for the Gear VR. It was a Rift launch title as well. And then I followed up with 3 more strategy games called Tactera, Skylight, and Astraeus. And Astraeus was an Oculus Go launch title, but that was my most recent game before this one.
Why did you pick this path onto Oculus Quest? Were there other options available to you, or was this? Why did you go with Kickstarter to get a game onto Quest?
It wasn't the plan from the very beginning, and I'm always very impatient to get my games done. So originally, I had hoped that I could even have an Oculus Quest launch title, and it just I ended up getting busy with some of the ports that I mentioned before and things like that. And so then I've kind of felt more and more like the Quest is having its moment, like it's really starting to explode. And I wanted to get into that. I wanted to get my game out there now and get it in players' hands. Kickstarter was kind of a late addition to that plan. And the thought behind that was basically, I could really use a little bit of extra development funding for some of the last few features that I wanted to add, but I couldn't responsibly self-fund those features pre-launch. So that was part of it. The other half of it was I wanted to get a population of players to get into the game before the main launch. A, because this is supposed to be a multiplayer game, and B, because I'm not going to be able to figure out how to balance things until I actually see it in the wild. So we ended up at this point with over 500 backers on the Kickstarter, and a lot of those are going to be participating in the beta. And so I'm hoping to get a lot of good feedback in the last couple of months before launch.
You're fully funded, and that's congratulations. Was it stressful to hit the go button on Kickstarter? Were you fearful you weren't going to make it?
Of course, yeah. I mean, you really never know. And Kickstarter, it kind of had its heyday back when the Oculus Rift was doing its Kickstarter and things like that. But it's quieted down a lot since then. It's still great for board game projects, but for video games, and especially for VR games, where most of the people out there don't have a headset, it's a lot more risky. And so, yeah, I really wasn't sure what to expect. And if the game hadn't gotten any interest, I still would have finished it. I just would have taken whatever measures I had to get it done. But I'm very grateful that it turns out that there were people who were interested in it.
Can you explain the mechanics and how you arrived at this particular type of game?
So I wanted to build a sword fighting game, which I think is a very common fantasy for VR. Everybody wanted to swing the sword since the very beginning. I remember even when the Wii came out, that's kind of the game that everybody wanted. And it's never really worked out for various reasons. For the biggest thing is if I'm swinging my controller, A, it doesn't weigh what a sword would, and so I can move it however fast I want. And then B, when it strikes something, my hand doesn't bounce back. My hand doesn't stop. And so that kind of ruined the feel of sword fighting for the vast majority of games. And so basically I took it upon myself, this project was going to be can I fix that? Can I figure out some solution that would still make it fun? I experimented with a lot of different things, and what we landed on was a system where every time you swing your weapon, it shatters when it hits something. So it makes sense that your hand keeps going because the weapon is gone. You get 1 hit per swing. And then to get your sword back, you have to kind of swing it back behind you. And so then you kind of end up with like a nice back and forth pattern, and can kind of get into a rhythm of things. And then we added some physics to the weapons so that they're kind of following your hand rather than being kind of just like glued on to your hand. And so now you can't swing infinitely fast. And then there were a couple of other like key mechanics that were kind of layered on top of that, and eventually it kind of came together. It started to feel like it was evoking that fantasy that I talked about at the beginning.
Mhm.
I feel like there's already a couple of good games where you play as kind of this like heroic fighter who can beat 20 guys at a time. And I wanted something that was more like a dueling game where there's a lot of like back and forth and parrying. And I feel like I got close enough to that it kind of gives me the feeling I was looking for when I started off on this project.
Multiplayer, you've got every system, right? How hard was that to architect?
Pretty tricky, I would say. So, I like to use whatever shortcuts and get whatever help I can get. And so I'm using an asset called Photon Bolt. Photon, they're creator of a bunch of different multiplayer middleware solutions. It was just kind of my job to not introduce anything that was a major difference between the platforms. They can look different, but in terms of the logic of the game and the physics, as long as they were all identical, then hypothetically, it should just work. And in our experience, so far it has. The harder part was making it work, with like a fighting game that has a little bit of latency from the multiplayer. But even playing like cross-country battles, we've found that it still works very well.
So what is the timeline after the Kickstarter here? What's your plan?
After the Kickstarter, the beta is going to launch immediately, basically. I'm trying to wrap that up and have something ready to start pushing out to the backers, as soon as I can after the Kickstarter ends. And then, there's a process in the background going on of quality assurance testing with Oculus. And all the Quest games will have to go through that before they can launch. So, until that's basically complete, you never know for sure when you're going to be able to launch. And so I've tried to avoid making any, very specific promises. I want to make sure that I can, under promise and over deliver. So all that I've said so far is that it's going to be launching in the spring.
How did the sort of approval process go with Oculus? Did you have to do the pitch document thing and then go through and you got some sort of tentative approval, right?
Yes. And it wasn't, too drawn out a process in my case. One thing that I think helped is that I had made so many games before that had launched on Oculus platforms. And so I think they knew me and they trusted that I could deliver a functional game. I also think it helped that Oculus, for very good reasons, they tell you don't start building your game for the Quest until we've given you approval, because they might not give that approval. And I just ignored that flat out. And I started building the game for the Quest, and I had a well-running functional prototype by the time that I submitted. And I was able to show some screenshots and say, look, it's very far along. Here's what it's going to look like. It already works with multiplayer, et cetera. And the reason I did that is because I knew that even if they rejected the game, I wasn't going to be giving up. I would just launch the game on Rift or wherever else I could and try to get on Quest later.
Pun intended here, I guess, but the double-edged sword there of the Oculus curation process is that developers seem to need to prove out their ideas even to themselves to a certain extent. And it's almost inescapable, it seems, to spend some time deving before you actually submit it to Oculus. I don't know how realistic that is to sort of send that document in without having done some of the work.
I feel like this is a perennial problem with the game industry. I've heard similar stories from people who are seeking funding from publishers, where they'd like to get some funding to build the game, or at least to build a prototype, and then as like a first stage. But very few publishers will listen to your pitch unless you already have a prototype. And so it seems to kind of just be like a hazard of the business that you have to be able to prove out your ideas ahead of time.
So since your products are available on multiple platforms and you've been at this for such a long time, Can you talk to me about how hard it's been to be an indie developer and what platforms you've seen success on? And
My first game came out as a launch title on the Gear VR. So that was the Gear VR Innovator Edition in December 2014. And they didn't even have a payment solution on the store. You could not sell your games. And so I was impatient to launch the game, and I decided to give the whole thing away for free for those first few months until they actually got, a payment solution hooked up. And then they added that, but there's still very few people who had a Gear VR back then. So at the time, it looked like it was going to be extremely slow, and who knew, where the money was going to come from. And then my later games, they came out when there was an established population, and there's a large group of people that were ready to take to buy the content. And so it's a little counterintuitive that my earliest games were by far more successful than the later games. Maybe that's because it was so much less crowded at the time, or maybe it's because they were able to make a name for themselves before there was so much competition. Maybe the early ones were just better games. But Darknet, and to a lesser extent Tactera, have kind of been the very slow and steady but winning the race. And then the later games, I'm especially proud of my most recent one, Astraeus, but very few people have played it. And the Oculus Go, I think at this point everyone looking at it is saying, like, it's not the place for games. Everybody talks about it as sort of a media viewing device. And the game that I built for that device just kind of, it didn't do nothing, but it kind of fizzled. Yeah, and so I think that I overall have been extremely lucky and privileged being able to get into VR when I did, and be able to have some of those early successes that have let me keep going for this long. But with the new game, with Ironlights, I decided to try to go much bigger. My conclusion from watching this dynamic of each game getting less and less of a response was that I can't just make sort of smallish niche strategy games anymore. I want to make something that is a lot more ambitious and that has a better chance of standing out. So Ironlights is now, it's about twice as big in terms of development budget and team as my previous games. That's still very, very small in the grand scheme of things, but for me, it's a really big deal. It's it feels like a big risk.
Have you thought about bringing your other games to Quest? How did that process go?
First of all, I just have been so focused on Ironlights. At a certain point, I felt like, man, I had the idea for this game years ago, and I just want to get it done. So I'm not going to even consider other projects until it's ready. But then also, I felt like the previous games were designed for the hardware of their times. In all of them, it's nice to have 6 degrees of freedom, but they play perfectly well with 3 degrees of freedom. And so it felt like they weren't really taking full advantage of the Quest. Then later, Oculus, they instituted a compatibility layer so that you can play certain Oculus Go games on the Quest. And they took my earliest 2 games, Darknet and Tactera, and made those playable on the Quest. It's of course not the same thing because they're not available in the Quest store, but those games, they work on the Quest, and I feel like there's, the amount of effort it would take to go back into the old code and get it all up to speed again, and especially to really, push it forward. Compared to what I can do on Ironlights right now, I feel like it's not the best use of my time.
What's the rest of 2020 hold for you? How long of a project is Ironlights sort of going to hold your focus?
The plan is to stay working on Ironlights for a very long time, for at least several months. I would be a little disappointed if I were to stop working on Ironlights after, a year or 9 months or so. And hopefully I can keep working on it for a very long time indeed. The hope is that there will be a community that builds around this game, and something that I can kind of keep pouring effort into and keep trying to make the game more and more alive and more vibrant. I feel like this is a game that has so much potential. I feel like maybe every developer feels this way about their own game, but I can imagine so many things that I could add to it that would make it better and better and better.
Not needing to have the one-to-one matchup between what you're holding and what you're actually doing with what you're holding in a virtual space. The most recent example is Walking Dead, and then Boneworks has it too, but this idea of giving heft and weight to the objects you're holding by making there be a disconnect there. Was that a hard conclusion to arrive at? That is in your title as well, right?
Yeah, and actually, it's very much accentuated in Ironlights because we do all the melee combat in slow motion. So all these weapons have weight. You can only pull them around so fast, and then when it goes into slow-mo, they get even slower. And the idea is that in the real world, you kind of have to move like you're in slow motion in order to maintain the best control over these weapons. And I just at the beginning I just felt like that felt cool, and as we went through development, it consistently felt to me more fun than doing things at full speed. But it's been kind of polarizing. It's something that I believe is very helpful and necessary for the game. But a lot of people, when they encounter it for the first time or they see video of it, they seem to kind of react poorly, or like bounce against it. Like one person was saying, like, if I can react in time, why don't you just let me, react? Why can't I just block the thing? A lot of people have requested like at least add a fast mode to the game, which maybe I can do. For me, it never felt unnatural, maybe because I was building it myself. And it definitely seemed like it was necessary, in order to build a game that felt fair and interesting, as opposed to just kind of like waggling your wrist at the other person, things like that.
Explain to me, do you need an internet connection even if you're in a living room together? Or can you just Wi-Fi connect and not actually need an external connection to the outside?
Right now, it's talking to the internet. So you do need a connection to talk to a matchmaking server. And then once you connect with your friend who's on the same Wi-Fi network, then the system tries to build a direct connection. And if it can, it will use the LAN connection. And then you're working on, with no latency. However, very soon, I will be announcing that Ironlights is going to appear at a trade show, and you cannot rely on the internet there. And so we are looking into trying to figure out a way to make it be entirely LAN based. We're going to try to bring in a router that's not connected to the internet at all, and just have the quests talk directly over that.
Since you came from indie dev, has regular 2D development appealed to you on an ongoing basis, or are you stuck in VR? What's sort of your appeal here of what you work on for the rest of your life?
Well, I sort of said at the beginning that I kind of fell into VR development. I didn't plan to be solely a VR dev, but once I got started, then here I was with some early experience in an emerging technology, and it just made sense to keep going with it. And I don't know how long that's going to continue. I will say I really like working in VR, and especially now that I'm dealing with the Quest, it's a lot of fun. But it's not, fundamentally like something that I need to have in order to do game development. I've made card games before. I've made 2D video games that are for couch-based co-op. The medium doesn't matter too much to me. What matters the most is that it's game design.
Do you ever see a future where this industry really supports larger teams? Do you think you'll be having a team of 6 or 10 or 15 working on a VR project someday?
There's one other full-time member on the team for Ironlights. And there's a group of contractors and an art studio that I'm working with. So it's maybe a little bit bigger than 2. That's kind of the situation that I was used to dealing with. And maybe because of that, it's almost like my experience is like the opposite of what you were describing, where it felt like as the industry matured, these tiny, small games became less viable, it's like, I need to grow. I need to start figuring out how to build bigger games and do more ambitious things. And that's going to be the way to stand out. So yes, like everybody's still sort of waiting to see like, when is this going to take off, or if it's going to. Personally, maybe it's because I hang out on the Oculus Quest subreddit too much, but it feels like the Quest is really like hitting a sweet spot. Like it's, I don't know, in terms of convenience and price point and performance and all of it, like this is the thing that I would truly recommend to other people. It's not just like, oh, you have to be an enthusiast or something. It's like, no, I have friends who would love that.
Yeah. No, I think that's the theme on a lot of what we've come to as reporters and as people who recommend this tech to everyone, where with every headset before Quest, we've always had to say, but this, but this, but this. It's $1,000 computer that you have to get to have this experience. It's a $200 Go that's great, but don't lean. Even PlayStation, don't turn around, but don't turn around. There's always a lot of exceptions, and even with Quest, there's a little bit of a weight situation, which is the only kind of warning I have to kind of give people is make sure you get the strap on there right, and maybe look into a counterweight if it's weighing down on your face too much. But yeah, it's been sort of a removal of all these exceptions and reasons why we wouldn't recommend it to people. And yeah, we're definitely seeing an enormous response out there.
The thing that's astounded me is that I already have a powerful computer. I already have the Vive base station set up and my Rift cameras in the room and everything already ready to go. And yet, by far, the most common VR experiences that I'm doing are the ones that are on the Quest. And I couldn't really place my finger on exactly what it was. I think that somebody made like a joke on Twitter where they were saying the pros and cons. Like PC VR has better resolution, more comfortable fit, better tracking, more flexibility, et cetera, et cetera. Quest actually works. And I feel like that's kind of been my experience too. Like I recently put on the Vive for development purposes, and I hadn't for a very long time, and I ended up with all the wires, kind of tangled up in a ball that was kind of pulling my head to the side. It had some stuttering that I had to diagnose and try to figure out, is it interfering with some other app or something? Various games would work better than others. Steam VR wasn't detecting my controllers right, and I had to repair them, et cetera, et cetera. That's not interesting. Nobody wants to do that. Whereas the Quest, every game that I get on there works.
Thank you so much for joining us, E, and can't wait to try the beta and get some time in there playing the game.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.